Hi guys, welcome back to Java Full Stack Made Easy. This is session 82 where we will talk about a very important concept about Spring, that is Spring Data JPA with MySQL. So in this session I'll show you how do we connect our Spring applications with the database and how do we read write data from a database. This is going to be a very important session where I will divide this session into multiple parts, and also initially, I will start up with very bare minimum things and then we will go with the industry standard so that it becomes easy for you to understand the concepts rather than directly going into the industry standards. So let's get started now. So the very first thing that I will do is I will first download a new Spring project. So let's go to the start.spring.io. From there, we will download a new Spring Boot project. So let's go to the Spring initializer. Java is the language that we are using, Maven, and then let's give the artifact ID as let's call it as Spring Data JPA. Okay, hyphen data hyphen JPA, or we can call it as Spring CRUD or anything. Okay, so Spring Data JPA is something that I'm naming it as. Let's call it as Spring Data JPA, and the package name I want would be Spring Data JPA without having a hyphen in it, because that's the standard. Package names don't have hyphens, right? So let's now talk about the dependencies. Here we will be requiring three dependencies. The very first is obviously the web dependency that we have been using in our Spring project for creating the controllers and creating the endpoints. Now the second dependency that comes up is the data JPA. Okay, so you select Spring Data JPA, and then the third dependency that we require is going to be the MySQL connector, that is the JDBC driver. Now if you don't know about the JDBC drivers or the JDBC concept altogether, then in future I'll create a tutorial on the JDBC as well, that is Java database connectivity. How do we connect our Java applications to the database? But here, since we have already covered up the concept about the Springs and Java and everything, so we will be connecting our Spring applications with the database, not the plain Java applications with the database. Reason for that is JDBC requires a lot of boilerplate code which is not required into Spring. So nowadays it's a standard that we are using Spring. So maybe in future I'll create one more tutorial on the JDBC. As for now, just consider JDBC is used to connect Java applications to the database. So let's generate this particular project. So once that project is generated, let's go to the downloads and then uh, extract that particular folder and then work on that. So we have the Spring Data JPA here. Let us extract this and import the same into our Eclipse. So I have already extracted that. Now let's get into the Eclipse and then import that particular project. So let's import the Spring Data JPA project. So import it as an existing Maven project, and let's go to the downloads where I have this particular folder downloaded, Spring Data JPA. Done. All right, so all three dependencies are ready, that is the Spring Data JPA dependency, web dependency, and the driver dependency. All three are ready. Now let us set up our application properties that allows us to connect to the database, which is again a very important step here. So application properties tells our application to connect to the database by using what URL, that means where do we have the database, and what is the port number of the database, what is the database that has to be used. So MySQL workbench, let us open our database as well, which we have discussed in our previous sessions. So let's open a connection here. So this was something that we have used before. So let us create a database for this. Let's call this as maybe something like a students or something. uh, Previously also I have created a database. Let's see what that database is. So the database is students DB, so we will be using this students DB itself, and I have created a table called as students there. So to avoid that conflict, what I will do is I will create a database and possibly name the database as yeah, let's call it as just the students. So create database students, because our Spring Data JPA can create tables for us, but it cannot create databases for us. So database should be created by ourselves. So we'll be creating the database. So the database is ready. You can see that a database is created. Let's go back to the application properties. So the very first application properties that I'm gonna give is the Spring dot data source dot URL. Okay, so Spring data source dot URL is in this case it is the JDBC colon MySQL. Now this can be different depending upon the type of database that you are using. Since Java is platform independent, so you can connect it with any of the database of your choice. So in this case I'm connecting it to MySQL database. That's why the port here, protocol here is the JDBC MySQL. So it can be Oracle as well. It can be any database of your choice. It can be MongoDB or any database. So whenever the database changes, you are going to change the URL for that. Okay, so it is the local host. That means the database resides on the same machine in which I'm writing this particular Spring application. And while connecting to this workbench, you might have noticed that the port number for my MySQL, the default one was 3306, right? So that's the default port number, and the database that I'm gonna use is the students database. So I should be writing the database name. So it is JDBC colon MySQL, then the host, which is localhost in our case, and then the port number 3306 in our case, which is the default port for MySQL, and lastly the database name, that is my students, which I have just now created. Right. So the second property that we have to set is the username. The third property that we have to set is the password. So let us set the username and the password for the same Spring Data Source username and the password. So username and password. So username I'll be using root, and the password is root 1234 in my machine. So that will be used root 1234. And this is about what, how do we connect to the database. I have provided the credentials to connect to the database and also the URL to connect to the database, right? Then I have to set couple of more properties. That is, whenever you talk to SQL database, MySQL talks to SQL differently, and the MS SQL talks to SQL differently, Oracle talks to SQL differently. So you need to tell your Hibernate, which is actually ORM, that is object relation mapping, which is an ORM framework that is used behind the scenes in Spring Data JPA. So indirectly we are using Hibernate itself, but Spring Data JPA uses Hibernate internally, so we need not bother about that particular thing. But we have to tell Hibernate what language it has to use to connect or to talk to the database. So we call it as a dialect. So a Spring JPA property has to be set for that. So which is Spring dot JPA dot properties dot Hibernate dot dialect. So we have to tell what is the dialect that will be used by Hibernate to talk to our database. So that in our case is org.hibernate.dialect MySQL dialect. Okay, so org.hibernate dot dialect dot MySQL dialect. So you need to ensure that this MySQL dialect that you have written has to be written in the capital cases. Sorry, it should be MySQL dialect this way. It has to be written because it's a case sensitive thing. Okay, so other properties also can be set for the Spring Data JPA, which is Spring Data JPA. Uh, Spring JPA, I will set another property which is again an optional property. Uh, I will consider this as an important thing, because we change these properties depending upon the level of application that we are developing. That means whether we are at the production level or at the development level. So during development we give a different property, and during production we give a different property, because on this property itself we are telling our Hibernate whether to create the tables or not to create the tables, right? So which is Spring .jpa .hibernate dot DDL, that is data definition language, DDL auto property. So this property I'm giving it as update for now. So update indicates if the tables do not exist, you create the table. If the table already exists, you're just gonna update those things. Okay, so this thing will be reused only during the development phase. If it is in the production phase, we will give this property as null. That means we don't want the customer, that means the application, to create the database for us, or the what we say, the application to create tables and modify the table structure for us. So that does not happen during the production phase. So during the development phase, for testing purpose, we create the tables, we drop. Once the application restarts, the table gets dropped, the table gets created once again. So those are the things that we do only during the development phase, not during the production. So during production, this property is gonna be set to none. Okay, so now I'm setting it to update, so that I want my Hibernate to create the tables for me. Fine. So this is an important thing which we are done with, that is the application properties. So I'm using only the bare minimum things that will be required for sure. So URL is required, username is required, password is required, right? That is the Spring data source properties. And then the Spring JPA properties, we require the dialect, and then we require the DDL auto property. So these are the five mandatory properties that are required, which I am providing in the application properties. Now the next thing that we require is going to be the entity class, the class that is going to be mapped to the table. ORM, object relation mapping. That means our class, our entity class will be mapped to a database table, that is ORM. So let's go ahead and create the entity class first. So I'll right click on the main package. Let's create a class, and in this particular class, what I'm gonna do is I will create the package as entity package itself. Okay, and the class name I will give it as the student. So that means when I create this, when I run this particular application, there should be a table created with the name student itself. Okay, so whatever entity we are giving, automatically it is going to create a table with that particular name. Now you might ask, what if my class name is user and I cannot create the table with the name user in SQL, right? So at that time we can change the table name by using an annotation called as @table name. So those solutions are provided, not to worry about such things, right? So what I have to tell, that this is an entity, right? So I have to take this as entity, Jakarta persistent entity it is. And whenever we are creating an entity must have an ID annotation. That means an ID attribute has to be there whenever we are creating an entity class. That ID attribute itself is the primary key of the table. So let's create that. So in this case, what I'm gonna do is I will create a private property of type long, and I'm gonna give it as ID, which will be called as the ID itself. So which is again Jakarta persistence ID in our case. Now what I will do is, I don't want this ID to be given by the user. That means when the user gives the student details like name of the student and maybe the age of the student or anything, at that time I don't want the user to provide the ID should be automatically generated. So to auto generate the ID, we have another annotation, that is a generated type. Okay, so which is, sorry, generated value. So generated value and the generation type, when the, let's set the strategy for this. Whenever we are generating the IDs automatically, at that time we have to provide this strategy based on the type of database that we are using, because this IDs can be automatically generated by using sequences, by using an identity column, because that actually depends on the kind of database that we are using. Identity columns are not present in Oracle database, whereas in MySQL database we have an identity column. So based on the type of database that we are using, we have to provide the strategy, that is the generation type. So let us give the generation type dot. So you can see that sequence is there, identity is also there, auto is there. So in this case, since I know that I'm using MySQL and I want to create a identity type of column for generating the IDs. Next is I will just generate few more properties, like maybe a string name and int age of the student or anything, I like, let's now mark them as private because that's a good practice. And yeah, let's mark this also as private. Now the next thing that we always do, that is gonna be generating the default constructor, generating the getters and the setters and the constructor with argument. That is because if we need that in future we might use it. So I generated the getters and setters constructor. Let us also generate a constructor using field. So in this case, I'm not generating the toString method or a hash code or a equals and all those methods. I'm just keeping it bare minimum. So in this case, what I have done for an entity is, most importantly, I have marked this particular class as an entity class. I mark this attribute as an ID attribute. That means this will be automatically generated. And while giving the students details, I will be giving only two details here. Okay. So the next thing, now we are done with creating the entity. So what you need to remember is this thing, what all I'm gonna create in this. Okay. So you remember it like this. What will I require? I require a class, entity class. So we'll have an entity class. Then we should have a repo, repository, that's nothing but what, data access object, DAO. Then service layer again is an optional thing, we may or may not create it. Okay, so I will talk about the service layer and service IMPL and everything in details, maybe in my next tutorials where, or the next sessions where I will be going with the concept of industry standard implementation of the Spring Data JPA. So we can create a repository here and we can directly jump to the controller. Okay, so in this case I'll be generating these three things. Entity class will be required, repository will be required, and a controller will be required for us. Okay, so I'm done with the entity class. Next thing is to create a repository. Repository is actually uh, Spring Data JPA repository that is predefined, that actually talks to the database, and a lot of code is auto returned there. So let's see how do we create a repository now. So since we are using a Spring Data JPA, a lot of things are happening internally. If you are a JDBC programmer, then you know how painful it is to write a JDBC code. So let us call this as a student repository. Okay, so this is a student repository that I'm creating, and obviously a repository here is an interface, not a class. So repository interface needs to just extend the JPA repository that is a part of Spring Data JPA, and then you have to provide the entity of what on which this repository is going to work. The entity is a student in our case, that has to be provided, and the ID has to be provided. ID in the sense, what is the type of that ID has to be provided. The type of the ID is of type long, right? That's something that we have created there. So we don't require anything to be defined here. It's gonna be a marker interface itself. That's because Spring Data JPA handles everything for us just the moment it sees this repository. So it does internally a lot of things, and we don't need to worry about writing anything within this. Fine. And the next thing, we can directly jump to the controller. Service layer would be required, but that is an optional layer. So since I told you I'm gonna create this Spring Data Data JPA application with the bare minimum thing, so I'll directly jump to the controller. So let's create a controller. Let's call this as a student controller. Okay, so let's generate that. And there we go, we have come to this particular stuff, the student controller. First of all, let's just mark it as a REST controller so that our Spring understands that it's a controller. And then the concept of request mapping, which is something that we have already seen in the previous session. So let's call this as students. So this is the students request mapping. And then what we have to do is we have to now take the object. That means we have to create an instance of this repository, and then based on that instance of the repository, we are gonna call the methods of the repository. That is, we can save the student, we can find the students and all that. So let's create the instance of the repository directly here. So we will say student repository, since we are in the Spring environment, so we know that we can auto wire the things, and we don't need to create the objects by ourselves, right? So let's call it as the repository. So once we are creating this repository, I will create a constructor using field for this particular class. So source generate a constructor using field generate. Okay, so I've generated this, and then what I will do is, for my controller I'm just gonna create a post mapping. For now let's create two things, a post mapping and a get mapping. Okay, get mapping to retrieve all the details from the database, the get mapping method, and the get mapping will be what, public uh, list of student, right? Get students or something. Okay, get all students or get students, I'm gonna create it that way. So let's just expand this, import the student, which is an entity, and this is gonna return the repository that we have created dot find all. So find all actually finds all the students available in the database. So that is the predefined method available in the repository. Okay, so that's why I told you a lot of things are managed by the Spring Data JPA itself. We don't need to worry much about these methods. Then let's have a post mapping that will be used to save a new student into the repository. Okay, that means new student into the database. So this is gonna return us what? This is gonna return us the same student that will be passed by the user, the same student. Let's call it as save student, and this save student, as we know that this will be given by the customer to us. So as a request body we will take it. So request body of type student, and whatever the student, whatever is given by the user to us, we will be saving that into the repository. So simply we will say repository dot save. Okay, the entity name is student in this case, so we'll do a repository dot save student. Okay, so you will notice that I'm not using any response entity here, or I'm not using a service layer. A lot of things I'm avoiding just to ensure, or just to know how easy it will be how easy it will be to talk to the database when we are making use of the Spring Data JPA concept. So let me just save this and try and run this application. So I'll go to the main file, which is the Spring Data JPA application.java. So let's run this as a Java application. If I go to marketplace and download the STS, at that time I should be able to run it as a Spring Boot application. So there is some error over here. Let us understand that it is org.hibernate.dialect.mysql dialect. So let us see, there must be some spelling error there, and yeah, it is about the Hibernate dialect itself. So which says the class not found. Yes, so it's all about the dialect itself. All right, so let us check the application properties and rectify the problem that we have created with the Hibernate dialect. So let's go to the application properties. So here it is, the Spring dot .jpa dot properties dot hibernate dot dialect org hibernate dot dialect MySQL. Okay, a was missing, so MySQL dialect it should be. So let's save it and run this application again. Okay, now it's fine. So I will go to the MySQL first, and here might have noticed that I've just created a database students. So I will just be doing a use student. So when I do a use student, so sorry, it is use students, which is the database name. So when I do a use students, you can notice that 0 rows affected. So that means I'm into the students database, which I have just now created. Okay, so in this database I did not create any table, right? But when I do a describe student, you notice I will get the table structure, that is, it contains ID, age and name, and also the ID is auto increment. You can see that here, a primary key, and it is a auto increment. Primary key, because I have annotated this class entity class as an IDs of primary key type. Then auto generated, because I have generated this as an identity column here. So you might now notice that I did not create a table. Hibernate itself is creating a table for me. The reason Hibernate is creating the table for me is because I have written the Hibernate DDL property as update. That means if the table does not exist, you create this table. Okay. So now let's go ahead and also see what is there into that particular table. The table as for now should not contain anything. So I'm gonna go for the select star from student. You notice that the table does not contain anything. Let us go to postman and now see what do we get there, right? So which is students, right? So let's hit send get. It should give us an empty object. We are getting an empty object. Now let's go to the body and provide in the details. So while providing the details, the ID is auto generated, so I will not be providing an ID. Name of the student has to be provided and the age of the student has to be provided. I'll provide the name and the age. Let's call the name of the student as Virat and age as 18, so which is our favorite data that we always write. Fine, so let's hit send and see the details. Sorry, it is a get method. I have to go for a post method, body, and let's hit send. So the moment I send it, now it is giving me a bad request. That means something is wrong when I'm giving the request. Let us now see the entity class and understand what is the bad request there. So this ID will be automatically generated. I have a string name and age. That is fine. So a name and age has to be given. Name and age is something which I am providing. So students, post method, body, that's fine. So let me do one more thing, that is I will try and insert the record from here and see the records. Insert into the student values, and the values will be what? The first value, since here I will provide the values as the name comma age. Two values I will insert. So let's insert that, name and age, and name will be Rohit, age 45. I will try and insert and see whether the records gets inserted. Yes, the records are inserted now. Let's see what is the details. So you can see that ID is auto generated and the records are generated. I will just do a commit because this is another session. That's why I have to commit it here. So I have done a commit. Now let's try and get the records and see whether we get the records or not. So we got the records. Let's get this from here. Put it here. Name and age is something that is required. So post mapping. ID will be generated automatically. So ID is not required for us. So just the name and age is required. So let's insert Virat and age. Let's hit send. Now still we are getting a bad request. That must be because of the request body. Let's see what is the problem in the request body that we are getting. Student controller. So in the student controller post mapping, we require a student body. That is fine. So repository dot save student. Okay, that also looks good. Request body of type student. Let's check whether the student is imported properly or not. So that is entity student. Let's save everything. Let's go to student, and we have a default one, student, and ID will be auto generated. Let's generate one more constructor and see. That looks good. Now let's first try and get all the students and see the result. So one student is there. Let's now post it. Let's post the details. Yes, that is because of the constructor that was not there in our case, which is because whenever I'm trying to perform a request body, so here you notice what I actually generated. I generated a constructor that takes only two arguments, that is name and age. So when I was binding this student here, when I was reading this student post mapping, so it was trying to bind the data for the student, and while binding the data it did not find out the constructor that takes two arguments. That is why it was giving us a bad request. So we could have also done what, we could have created a student object and we could have taken this and set the things manually, but what I did was a better way, where I created a constructor that takes only two arguments, because an ID was something that was auto generated. That's the reason it was giving me a bad request. So I hope that this is completely clear to you, and you now can appreciate the use of Spring Data JPA, where with just minimum efforts I'm able to store the data into the database. Not only storing this data into the database, if I wish to get the details by an ID, I can get it by ID, and there are a lot more other features like a delete method or an update method. They are all part of this repository, so we don't need to create them on our own. Fine. So let me just recap the things what we have discussed till now, or what all things will be required. So what I did was I just downloaded a Spring Boot project from the start.spring.io with three dependencies, the web dependency. So what I will do is I will put this into the repository, and there we can have a simple recap of the things. So let us call this as a day. What is this session now? Mostly session 82. Yes, as day 82. Okay, this is demo 1 about what, data JPA. Okay, so what I did, download a Spring Boot project with what all dependencies, with web comma Spring Data JPA and MySQL driver dependencies. So these three dependencies, then you have to obviously import the project in workspace, that is your Eclipse. So once you import that, then what all things we did was application.properties, we told our database, that means our Spring application, how to connect to our database. So application properties are something that we have written. Then after the application properties we went for the entity class. This is still not the industry standard I am following. In my next session I will try and follow the industry standard and include more security layers into this entity class. And then the next one, the repo, that is the repository, which is again simple, we are just extending it from the JPA repository. You might also see people inheriting, that means extending from the CRUD repository. CRUD repository is actually uh, the parent class of the JPA repository. So JPA repository contains everything from the CRUD repository, plus it contains more things. That means it is an extended version of the CRUD repository. So that's why I'm using a JPA repository here, not the CRUD repository. Then I'm using a controller. So this a student controller. That's it, right? After this you have configured two methods, right? So the get method and the post method. So the URL for the get method and the post method is same. Okay, so this is the URL for the get method. The same is the URL for the post method. I will give you the request body as well for your convenience. This is the post method. And before this I will give you the database. Okay, go to your MySQL workbench and there you set up the database. So before this, MySQL workbench. So in the MySQL workbench, I have simply done what? I just created a database. So you can go ahead and just create the database, use that database. Okay. And once you execute your application, at that time you can go ahead and check for the data, whether the data is present or not. So just for your convenience, I'm also adding these other uh, things that I'm using. So this has to be done only after run your Spring Boot and check these commands. So the below commands, that is describe the student, select star from student, insert the data, and commit, has to be only done after you execute your Spring Boot application successfully. Okay, so obviously in this case what can be changed, I will write it here, that is the password. So I will write it in the capital case, your MySQL password. Okay, so and also if you have changed the port number during installation, you have to change the port number since the database is student. So if it is any other database, you have to change that as well. Okay, so these are the properties that can be changed, that can be modified. All right, so I hope that you are enjoying in the series, and in the next session we will be following the industry standard. In this case, in this session I have only shown you how do you connect to a database using Spring Boot application, where Spring makes our life easy to connect or talk to the database. In the next session, we will see the industry standards, where we will bring in the concept of the security as well, and the DTOs, and we will talk about the service layer and all those things. So if you are liking in the series, comment and subscribe to my channel to motivate me to create more such content. If you have any doubt, you can always reach out to me on my LinkedIn profile. Thank you. See you in the next video.